When we say World War, we imagine the 1900s, but in the 1750s, fighting, shipping, and money were already global. A decision in a European palace could change a fort on an American river, a convoy in the Atlantic, and a trading post in India. The 7 Years' War wasn't one battlefield, it was a network of battlefields connected by oceans, credit, and alliances. This is the story of the first true World War, a system that learned to fight everywhere at once. European empires were like giant companies with scattered branches. Colonies shipped wealth home, and home governments shipped protection back. But distance creates delays. Delays create uncertainty, and uncertainty invites rivals to test weak points. By the 1750s, France and Britain were already poking each other's edges, especially where rivers and ports could become choke points. Then the alliances flipped. Austria wanted Prussia back under control. France wanted Britain checked at sea. So former rivals found common cause, and former partners grew suspicious. Diplomacy isn't poetry, it's math. Who can help you achieve your goal at the lowest cost? In 1756, Europe rebalanced like a chessboard mid-game. Britain's strategy leaned on two superpowers, credit and the navy. With money, Britain could subsidize allies. With ships, Britain could cut enemy supply lines. It was a choice to fight with a balance sheet and a blockade, turning the ocean into a weapon. If the sea lanes stayed open for Britain and closed for France, the global war would tilt. Prussia looked strong on a map until you counted enemies. Austria to the south, Russia to the east, France to the west, and smaller states nearby. A small power facing a coalition often chooses speed and surprise, because waiting means being crushed. Frederick's plan was simple and terrifying. Strike first, move fast, and never let the coalition settle. The war's opening logic was preemption. Frederick moved to disrupt his rivals before their armies could coordinate. That kind of strategy is risky. It can win quickly, or create more enemies. But in a system where time favors the larger coalition, small states gamble on tempo. The 7 Years' War begins as a race, coordination versus speed. Armies eat money, pay soldiers late, and discipline collapses. Supply them poorly and morale breaks. So governments built credit machines, loans, taxes, and promises of future revenue. But every loan is a future burden, and every tax touches ordinary families. In a global war, finance becomes a second front, quiet, relentless, and unavoidable. 18th century armies didn't teleport. They marched, slowly, and their power depended on wagons, depots, and roads. Cut the bread, and you cut the army. Protect the bread, and you protect the state. This is why forts, rivers, and ports mattered. They were storage points for survival. Strategy was often just supply and costume. Once the alliance network locked in, the war naturally expanded. Each empire attacked where it had advantages. Britain at sea, France and colonies, Austria and Central Europe, Russia in the east. When you fight on many fronts, your opponent must choose where to be weak. The system rewarded whoever could coordinate across distance, ships, money, and messages. By 1756, the war was no longer a local dispute. It was a connected contest, alliances in Europe, empires overseas, and a financial engine funding it all. The question became which system breaks first, land coalitions or ocean supply lines. Next, we follow the fire as it spreads to the forests and rivers of North America, where a fort can decide an empire. In North America, geography did the talking. Rivers were highways, forests were cover, and forts were locks on movement. French strategy focused on river corridors, linking Canada to the interior. British strategy aimed to break those links and expand settlement, but neither side could move freely without local allies who understood the land. Here, diplomacy and survival walked side by side. A fort is more than walls. It's a warehouse, a signal, and a promise of protection. Build one at a key junction and you can tax movement, control trade, and shape alliances. Lose it and your whole corridor weakens. In this war, forts function like router hubs in a network, small structures with huge ripple effects. Indigenous nations had their own goals, security, trade, and keeping rivals from dominating. European powers offered goods and support, but also brought risk. Choosing an ally could protect your people or drag you into conflicts you did not control. The war's global system depended on local decisions made at campfires and council circles. Much of the North American War was about raids, scouting, and supply disruption. Destroy a storehouse, and you win without fighting. Surprise mattered because armies were small and reinforcement took months. In this theater, the winner was often whoever could move quietly and keep supply lines intact. European-style sieges still mattered because a fortified node could block an entire river system. But sieges were expensive and slow. Every day at a siege burned food, morale, and money, while disease and weather did the silent damage. The hourglass was always running, and the defender hoped the attacker's sand would run out first. Britain could feed North America through the sea. Ships brought soldiers, supplies, and artillery, if they weren't intercepted. So the naval war and the land war were one system. The ocean was the conveyor belt to the front. When the belt ran smoothly, Britain could concentrate force in a way France struggled to match. France had talented commanders and strong positions, but a harder supply problem. Long distances, fewer settlers, and contested sea lanes made resupply fragile. When supply is fragile, every decision becomes defensive. Preserve nodes, avoid big risks, wait for relief. The system punished fragility by turning small losses into big collapses. Some places were not just cities, they were switches. Control the switch, and you control movement, trade, and the future map. When both systems recognized the same switch, pressure built toward a decisive gamble. Decisive moments happen when networks narrow into a single choke point. When a key node fell, the corridor system shifted. Alliances recalculated, supplies rerouted, and defenses became harder to coordinate. This didn't end the war overnight, but it changed the direction of advantage. In network wars, tipping points are often logistical, not heroic. By now, Britain's sea-based reinforcement system was beating France's thinner supply lines. But the war was still global, and resources spent in America were resources not spent in Europe or India. Next, we follow the conflict into the Indian Ocean world, where companies, cash, and coastal forts turned trade into war. In India, European powers arrived as traders, not conquerors, at least at first. But trade posts needed protection, and protection needed soldiers, and soldiers needed money. Once private companies began hiring armies and influencing local politics, commerce became a form of state power. Here, the battlefield was the balance sheet as much as the fort wall. A company's goal is profit, but profit can require stability. So companies built armies to stabilize trade routes, secure taxes, and shape alliances with local rulers. This blurred the line between business and government. When private decisions can start wars, you're in a global system with many engines, not one. Local rulers and factions had their own rivalries and needs. European support could be a tool to win a local contest, but it came with strings. Those strings were money, weapons, and commitments. Once tied, everyone's choices narrowed, and a local dispute could become part of a global war. In the Indian Ocean, ports were the gates of the whole system. Control a good harbor, and you can land supplies, repair ships, and move armies along the coast. Lose it, and your presence shrinks to a vulnerable outpost. Sea power wasn't only about battles. It was about keeping your ports breathing. Wars in India were also wars over revenue. Who collects taxes? Who controls trade tolls? Who pays soldiers on time? A paid army stays loyal. An unpaid army looks for a new patron. In a multi-sided contest, loyalty can become a marketplace. European officers needed reliable forces adapted to local climates and conditions. Training, drills, and shared routines created predictability. Predictability made supply planning possible, and planning makes armies stronger than their numbers. This was industrial thinking applied to soldiers. Standardize, repeat, scale. Sometimes victory wasn't about destroying an enemy army. It was about securing a pipeline, port to depot to battlefield, while breaking the enemy's pipeline. If your opponent can't pay or feed their forces, their system collapses from inside. In India, pipelines were routes of power. Back in Europe, ministers looked at India as a ledger line, expensive but valuable. They made choices based on naval availability, global priorities, and political pressure at home. Local commanders fought with what the empire could spare, not what the battlefield demanded. Distance turned strategy into compromise. The company wars showed the future. Global conflict fought through finance, contracts, and supply chains. Control the cash, control the troops, control the ports, control the cash. That loop is a machine, and machines once built tend to run faster every year. By now, the 7 Years' War was truly global. Europe, North America, India, and the oceans connecting them. Next, we return to Europe, where Prussia fights for survival under crushing pressure, proving that land wars can be as much about endurance as genius. Prussia's problem was simple. One mistake could end the kingdom. Coalition armies could return every year with fresh numbers, while Prussia's losses were harder to replace. So Frederick aimed for sharp, fast victories to buy time. Time to keep allies loyal and enemies uncertain. In a survival war, time is territory. Frederick's army emphasized drill and speed. If you can concentrate forces faster than your enemy, you can win locally, even when you're outnumbered globally. This is the core logic of maneuver warfare. But speed costs energy, and energy must be replenished by supply. Coalitions are powerful, but they have friction. Different goals, different timetables, different egos. One ally wants a siege, another wants a chase, a third wants to protect its own border. That friction creates opportunities for a smaller, faster opponent. Frederick tried to turn coalition strength into coalition delay. Campaign seasons were bounded by weather. Winter shut roads, froze rivers, and turned supply into a nightmare. Armies quartered in towns, and civilians bore the burden through requisition and scarcity. The home front wasn't a separate place, it was the fuel tank of the war machine. As years passed, the war became an endurance contest. Even victories cost trained soldiers that could not be replaced quickly. Every army faced the same question: how long can we keep paying, feeding, and replacing losses? The pressure gauge climbed for everyone, especially smaller states. Britain's money acted like reinforcement. Subsidies helped Prussia keep armies in the field and keep allies aligned. This is a systems lesson. Finance can substitute for manpower. But subsidies also create dependence. If the money stops, the strategy must change overnight. Strategy depended on imperfect information. Messengers rode for days. Reports arrived late or wrong. In a fast-moving war, acting on stale information can be worse than acting on none. So leaders learn to plan with uncertainty, building flexibility into decisions. Every system has moments where it almost breaks. For Prussia, a single lost campaign could mean invasion, occupation, and political collapse. The closer a system gets to failure, the more extreme its decisions become. Riskier gambles, harsher requisitions, tighter discipline. Survival can force choices that reshape a society. By the early 1760s, Europe's land war looked like a grinding stalemate. Costly moves, limited gains. Meanwhile, the sea war was tilting colonial outcomes. This mismatch mattered. If one side wins overseas, it can negotiate from strength, even if Europe is unclear. The war's center of gravity was shifting toward ships and treaties. Prussia had survived by moving fast, enduring winter, and leaning on finance. But the war was about more than Prussia. It was about global empires. Next, we follow the fleets to the Caribbean and beyond, where islands and convoys decide who can afford to keep fighting at all. At sea, distance becomes immediate. A convoy lost in the Atlantic means a garrison hungry in Canada or India. Navies were not just fighting forces, they were the connectors of empire. Control the connectors and you control what your opponent can reinforce. Convoys carried soldiers, food, and treasure. They moved slowly and had to be protected. This created a classic systems trade-off: concentrate ships for safety, or spread them out to cover more routes. Every choice left some edge exposed. France often used privateers, fast raiders funded by investors, to pressure British trade. It was economic warfare. Capture cargo, raise insurance costs, create panic. Privateering shows how markets and war blend. Profit-seeking can serve strategy. But private raiders can't replace a fleet when a port needs relief. In the Caribbean, islands were not just land, they were warehouses of sugar and ports for fleets. Capture an island, and you gain revenue, a naval base, and leverage at the peace table. So islands became bargaining chips, fought over like chess pieces. Sea power turned small places into big prizes. Amphibious operations were complicated: tides, beaches, weather, and coordination. But they let Britain strike where land armies couldn't easily defend. A successful landing could seize a key port and collapse an entire regional defense. This is why naval mobility is strategic leverage. Blockades were slow, patient strangulation. If enemy ships cannot leave port, colonies cannot be supplied, and fleets cannot concentrate. A blockade doesn't need dramatic battles. It needs endurance and discipline. It's control by waiting, turning time into a weapon. Because the war was global, it eventually spilled into the Pacific world too. Sea lanes stretched across oceans, and distant forts suddenly mattered. When a conflict spans hemispheres, no colony feels remote anymore. Remote becomes next, if your opponent has ships. Fleets are expensive. Ships, sailors, repairs, and supplies. Winning at sea can win the war, but it also piles up debt. Governments borrowed against the future to pay for the present. That future would matter after the peace, when someone had to pay the bill. As sea control tightened, outcomes overseas became harder to reverse. A lost colony is not just lost land, it's lost revenue and lost bargaining power. Even if Europe stayed contested, the colonial ledger was tilting. The peace table was starting to take shape long before the treaties were signed. By the early 1760s, sea power was turning victories into permanent leverage. Yet Europe still raged, and then suddenly, the whole board flipped in 1762. Next, the year of reversals, new entrants, and dominoes that changed the final settlement. Systems can grind for years and then change in a season. In 1762, alliances and priorities shifted, and the war's geometry transformed. A single government change could flip an army from enemy to absent, or even to friend. In a coalition war, politics is battlefield terrain. Russia had been a major threat to Prussia, but when Russian policy shifted, pressure on Prussia eased dramatically. This is why coalitions are unstable. They depend on internal politics, not only shared goals. For Prussia, the pivot was like oxygen returning to a burning room. Austria still wanted Prussia contained, but the cost was rising, and the coalition balance had changed. When your partners shift, your strategy must adapt. At some point, an objective becomes too expensive to buy. That is when diplomacy re-enters as a tool of survival. Then Spain entered the war, widening the maritime contest. New ports, new convoys, new targets, more nodes in the global network. But entry also meant vulnerability. A late entrant can lose key assets quickly if the opponent already has momentum. Joining a running war is like stepping onto a moving conveyor belt. With new entrants and shifting alliances, attacks targeted high-value colonial nodes. Seize an island, a harbor, or a convoy hub, and you gain leverage at the peace table. The war's endgame became about bargaining power, not just battlefield pride. Every capture was a negotiation chip made real. As sea lanes stretched across the globe, even the Pacific could become a stage. What mattered wasn't distance, but whether ships could sustain themselves. Ports, water, repairs, and timing. Global war turns oceans into connected spaces, not barriers. If you can sail there, you can fight there. By 1762, the debt meters were high. Governments could still borrow, but at increasing political cost. Citizens felt taxes, shortages, and uncertainty. The war's final phase was a race between military advantage and financial fatigue. Even with pressure easing, Prussia still had to hold its position. A system saved by one shock can still fail if it relaxes too soon. Frederick's goal became stabilization. avoid catastrophe, keep the army intact, reach the peace table standing. By late 1762, leaders were already negotiating in their heads. What can we trade? What must we keep? What can we afford to lose? This is where global wars become global bargains. Land tiles, port nodes, and debt coins on a scale. The fighting continued, but the future was being priced. 1762 rearranged the board. Coalitions shifted. Empires widened the fight and budgets hit their limits. Now the war moved toward peace, an engineered settlement that would redraw maps and create new problems. Next, 1763, when treaties turned battle outcomes into a new world order. Treaties are not just signatures, they are new rules for the system. They decide who controls ports, who pays debts, and which empires get bigger. A treaty can end one war and plant incentives for the next. In 1763, peace was engineered to stabilize Europe while reshaping global empires. The war ended with more than one agreement because the war had more than one logic. In Europe, the goal was balance, stop endless coalition war. Overseas, the goal was empire, decide who controls which colonies and trade routes. One conflict, two settlements, one global outcome. France faced hard choices. Keep certain islands and trade benefits, or keep territory elsewhere. When an empire is overstretched, it chooses what it can defend and what it can rebuild. Losing territory can be a strategic retreat if it preserves the core. But retreats also change prestige, and prestige affects future alliances. Britain emerged with a larger empire and stronger sea position, but bigger empires cost more to administer and defend. Garrisons, officials, roads, and ships, those are recurring costs. The victory created a bill, and the bill would soon be handed to someone. In Europe, Prussia's survival mattered because it preserved a new power in the center. Austria did not get everything it wanted, but the balance stabilized compared to total collapse. Sometimes a war ends not with a clear winner, but with exhaustion and a stable line. That line becomes the next century's puzzle piece. After the war, governments faced debt and expectations. Paying soldiers and creditors required taxes. Taxes require legitimacy. When people feel they paid for a victory they can't see, politics gets dangerous. The war ended, but the financial aftershocks began. Peace didn't erase the global network. It reorganized it. Trade routes reopened under new flags, new rules, and new monopolies. Companies and navies learned which logistics patterns worked and which failed. That learning became the template for later empire building. Local peoples often faced the biggest changes with the least control. Alliances made during war didn't always translate to security after peace. Borders drawn far away could disrupt trade, diplomacy, and everyday life. This is another World War lesson. Global decisions create local consequences. By 1763, the map of influence had shifted. Britain's position strengthened across oceans. Prussia proved it could survive great power pressure. France adapted and prepared to compete again. And everywhere leaders had learned, ships, money, and logistics can decide wars as much as battlefield courage. The treaties ended the fighting, but they also created new incentives, bigger empires, higher taxes, and sharper rivalries. Now we step back and ask the big question. Why does the 7 Years' War deserve the title, First True World War? The answer is in the system it revealed. A world war is not just many battles. It's a system where theaters affect each other directly. Sea control changes land outcomes. Finance changes troop levels. Colonies change peace terms. In the 7 Years' War, those links were real and constant. It was global because its inputs and its consequences were global. Alliances are like machines. They multiply power, but they need maintenance. Different goals create friction, and friction creates failure points. The diplomatic revolution showed that alliances can flip when incentives change. In coalition wars, diplomacy is not background. It is the steering wheel. Armies and navies are only as strong as their supply. Food, powder, repairs, pay. These are the true weapons of endurance. The war proved that cutting the pipeline can be as decisive as winning a battle. Modern war would scale this lesson with industry. The logic began here. Sea power turned distance into strategy. It allowed Britain to reinforce globally and deny reinforcement to rivals. It also made the Caribbean and other islands central, not peripheral. When oceans become roads, ports become capitals. Credit let governments fight longer than current taxes could afford. But debt must be serviced, and that creates political stress after victory. The war's biggest explosions may have been delayed, appearing later as arguments over taxes and representation. Finance doesn't end when the war ends. It changes what peace can be. In India, companies acted like states. They raised armies, made alliances, and collected revenue. This shows a modern pattern. Institutions outside governments can still wield military power when rules allow it. Corporate war expands conflict in unpredictable ways because profit incentives are different from national incentives. The 7 Years' War previewed that complexity because the war was fought on multiple continents, in multiple oceans, and through linked systems of money and supply. It fits the definition. Europe provided alliances and armies. The oceans provided connection and denial. Colonies provided stakes and bargaining chips. The war was not global by accident, it was global by design of empire. After 1763, empires reorganized and rivalries adapted. New possessions required new administration. New debts required new policies, and new confidence encouraged new risks. World wars leave systems changed, not simply ended. The deepest takeaway is that globalization, trade routes, finance networks, and distant possessions makes wars spread. When your economy spans oceans, your conflicts will too. The 7 Years' War revealed the mechanics early. Connect the world and you connect your rivalries. That is why it feels modern, even in powdered wigs and wooden ships. The 7 Years' War shows how modern conflict begins, not with one battle, but with systems linking decisions across the world. Alliances flipped, supply chains stretched, navies turned oceans into roads, companies became armies, and debt financed endurance. By 1763, the fighting stopped, but the world was rewired. That's why historians call it the first true world war. It taught empires how to fight globally, and taught the world how expensive global power can be.